There's something funny about getting older in this business. The titles fade first, the numbers go next, the gate, the payoffs, the records nobody checks anymore. People always asked Big John Studd about Andre. They asked about WrestleMania, about that $15,000 slam everybody still brings up at autograph tables. But that was never the first thing on his mind when he sat alone with it. What came first were 5 faces. 5 men who shaped what he became before any of that mattered. These were the names that came to him faster than anybody else. The first man worth talking about is Killer Kowalski. When Studd first walked into that gym in Los Angeles, 18 years old, he figured his size alone would carry him. He was wrong. At first, he didn't know what to make of Kowalski cold, exact, never raising his voice. Kowalski didn't look at him like a prospect. He looked at him like a problem he hadn't decided to solve yet. What people didn't see was the weight Kowalski carried training big men. Everybody wanted to be the next giant back then. Most of those kids quit inside a month, bodies too heavy for the discipline required to move them safely. Kowalski absorbed every one of those failures personally. His gift to Studd wasn't strength. Studd had strength walking in the door. What Kowalski gave him was structure, the line between being big and being dangerous on purpose. He never told Studd he did something well. He told him what he did wrong, then made him repeat it until his body stopped arguing with him. There was a session early on, winter of 1966, concrete floor, no padding worth mentioning. 50 falls in a row, the right way, not 49, 50. His shoulders were raw by the end. Kowalski didn't say a word of comfort. He just nodded once and said, "Now you won't kill yourself out there." That nod changed how the locker room treated him. Word got around fast that Kowalski's guy didn't cut corners. That reputation followed Studd into every territory he ever worked. When he thought about Kowalski later in life, he thought about foundation. Everything he built after him sat on concrete poured when nobody else was watching. The next man worth talking about is Ken Patera. When Studd first worked alongside him, he had his doubts. Olympic lifter, amateur background. That clean, athletic credibility carved into him from the day he set a world record on a platform instead of a wrestling mat. Studd figured he didn't understand what this business actually required underneath the surface, the lying, the selling, the part of it that has nothing to do with how much weight a man can move. What people underestimated about Ken was the weight of proving himself twice over. Once to the legitimate sports world that never quite forgave him for leaving it, and then all over again to a locker room that assumed strength like his couldn't translate to psychology, to timing, to the instincts this business actually runs on. He proved Studd wrong fast. The quality that made Ken irreplaceable wasn't his power. It was trust without negotiation. In a tag team, 2 big men can get in each other's way constantly. Egos, timing, who takes the spotlight. With Ken, none of that existed. He moved when Studd needed him to move, and Studd moved when he needed it, and neither of them ever had to discuss it beforehand. There was a night in November of 1984, Madison Square Garden, the air thick with that old building's heat under the lights. They'd just put away Andre and Special Delivery Jones. What came after needed precision, cutting a piece of Andre's hair in front of 20,000 people. No rehearsal room for that kind of moment. No second take if it went wrong. One wrong second, and the whole thing falls apart into something sloppy, instead of something the crowd remembers for years. Studd and Ken didn't need a signal. They just knew. That kind of synchronization changes a locker room's confidence in 2 men. Other teams started asking to work with them specifically because they knew nothing sloppy would happen out there. Promoters trusted them with moments other tag teams never got handed. When Studd thought about Ken later, he thought about sync 2 heavy men moving like one machine, never a beat out of place. The next man worth talking about is Bobby Heenan. When Studd first met him, he'll admit Heenan annoyed him. Small, loud, always talking, always working an angle even when nobody asked him to. At first, Studd didn't know what to make of him. He thought Heenan was just noise riding the coattails of men who actually did the work in that ring. What people never gave Bobby credit for was the abuse he absorbed on their behalf, night after night, in building after building. Fans threw things at him. Writers called him cheap, a cartoon villain. Nothing more than comic relief between the real matches. Nobody saw the hours he spent in hotel rooms rewriting a single promo line, because the wrong word in the wrong city could undercut everything they'd built in the ring the week before. His gift was intelligence applied in service of someone else, never himself first. Bobby saw value in Stud before the audience did, before Stud even saw it in himself most days. He understood exactly how to frame size as menace instead of spectacle, how to make a crowd hate Stud just enough that they couldn't stop watching. There was a night before facing Hogan at the Garden in 1984, both of them in a back room. Nobody bothered to clean properly. Bobby sat with Stud for almost an hour, not talking strategy for the match itself, just the walk to the ring, how to look at the crowd, when to stop, when to ignore them completely and let the silence do the work instead. Small details, the kind most men in this business never bother learning. He was right about every single one of them. That kind of preparation changes how a locker room views a manager. Younger heels started asking him for notes before their own segments, lining up outside whatever room he was using that night. He never said no, even when there was nothing in it for him. When Stud thought about Bobby later, he thought about cunning, not the cheap kind people accused him of from the cheap seats, but the kind spent protecting the men standing next to him, with nobody ever thanking him for it on camera. The next man worth talking about is King Kong Bundy. When Bundy first joined the Heenan family, Stud kept his distance. He'd spent years being the biggest man in most rooms he walked into. Now there was another giant standing in the same hallway, and some part of him resented sharing that space without ever saying so out loud. What people did to Bundy was unfair in a quiet way that never showed up in any headline. Every interview, every comparison, always Andre first, Stud second, Bundy third, like he was an echo of two men instead of his own person standing on his own legs. Nobody asked what it cost to be measured against giants, and never once measured on his own terms. What made Bundy irreplaceable had nothing to do with size, even though size was the first thing anybody noticed about either of them. It was steadiness. He showed up. Every date, every taping, every house show in some town nobody remembers the name of anymore. Bundy was there, on time, ready, no excuses offered, and none expected from him either. There was a summer in 1986, Boston Garden, a building with no air conditioning worth mentioning. Lights baking the canvas until it felt like standing on asphalt in late August. He'd hurt his back the week before, somewhere on the road between towns. Nobody outside that locker room knew it. He never said a word about it to the boys, took his bumps against the machines like nothing was wrong underneath that singlet, and walked out the same way he walked in. That kind of reliability settles a locker room more than people realize from the outside. Younger guys looked at Bundy and understood that complaining wasn't part of the job description, no matter how big you were or how much the road had taken out of you that week. He set that standard without ever raising his voice about it. When Stud thought about Bundy later, he thought about steadiness, the kind that doesn't need applause to keep showing up. And the last man Stud truly respected the most was Andre the Giant. When he first stood across the ring from him, he told himself it was simple business, two big men, one storyline, a paycheck waiting at the end of it. At first, he didn't know what to make of Andre. He didn't talk much, not in the way most of them did. He watched. He let other people do the talking, and somehow that made him harder to read than anyone else in the building. What people never understood about Andre was the weight he carried that had nothing to do with strength at all. His body was failing him from the inside for years before most fans knew the word for it. Every night he stepped into that ring, knees aching, hands swollen past what any glove could fit. He was fighting something none of the cameras could see, and he never once asked anyone backstage to make it easier on him. The quality that made Andre impossible to replace in Stud's life wasn't his size. It was honesty disguised as rivalry. Everything between them was real, in a way the storyline never had to manufacture. They weren't pretending to dislike each other for the cameras. They were two men who genuinely needed to prove which one of them mattered more in a business built entirely on giants, and that need was the most honest thing either of them ever brought into that ring. There was the first WrestleMania, March of 1985. Madison Square Garden packed past capacity. $15,000 on the line in cash nobody fully trusted would change hands. And the sound when Andre finally got underneath Stud and drove him down to that canvas, the whole building shook with it, all the way up into the rafters. Stud felt that slam in his teeth, in his spine, in places that ached for days after. Andre took the money. Heenan stole it back before the night was finished. None of that mattered next to what Stud felt standing back up off that canvas and looking him in the eye. They spent years trying to prove the other one wasn't real, wasn't the true giant of this business. Andre was sick longer than most of them ever realized while it was happening, and they never said the things to each other that needed saying before his health gave out entirely, and there was no more time left for either of them. That part stayed with Stud more than any slam ever could. They ran out of time before either of them ran out of pride. When he thought about Andre later, he thought about respect carved out of years of refusing to back down from each other, and the sacrifice neither of them ever spoke about out loud, not once, not even at the very end. The older Stud got, the more he realized how much of this business was noise, the kind that feels enormous while you're standing inside it, and almost weightless the moment you step away. The headlines fade first. The win-loss records, the storylines, the feuds that felt like life and death at the time, all of it gets quieter every year, until most of it goes silent altogether. What doesn't fade is the locker room. The look on a man's face right before he walks through that curtain, when there's no more time to rehearse and nothing left to do but trust the man standing next to him. The trust you either had with someone or you didn't, and no promo, no payoff, no $15,000 in cash ever changed which one it was. That's why these 5 names meant something deeper to Stud than anything ever written about his career. They were never about wins. They were about who stood next to him when the lights went out and nobody else was watching anymore. Kowalski gave him foundation, the concrete underneath everything he ever built in this business. Patera gave him sink, the kind of trust that never needed a word spoken to confirm it. Heenan gave him cunning, spent entirely in his defense, never once in his own. Bundy gave him steadiness he could set his own standard against. And Andre gave him respect built from years of 2 stubborn men refusing to yield an inch to each other, right up until time ran out on both of them. What made that era special was never the size of the men standing in it, even though size was the thing every poster led with. It was the trust underneath all that size, the kind nobody in the cheap seats ever saw, and nobody writing the recaps ever thought to mention. People remember the slam. They remember the rumble, the titles, the stretchers Stud used to wheel out before a match even started. He remembered the 5 faces that taught him what carrying real weight actually means. The titles still fade, same as they always have. The faces never did. Strength was never the hardest thing Stud learned in this business. Trust was. It took longer to earn than any muscle ever did, and it disappeared a lot faster if you weren't careful with it. If you had to walk back into that locker room one more time, who are the people you'd want standing beside you?